So please welcome Bill Kramer.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Before we start, I'll just give you a little bit of background about WRI. We're a group of about 140 in Washington, D.C. We work on 4 major areas: climate change, ecosystem services, governance, and the area in which I work, which is sustainable enterprise, markets and enterprise. So my work, and work of Al and the rest of our group, is at this intersection of business and development. How can you get enterprises beneficially engaged with low-income populations in ways that are sustainable, that is from an environmental perspective, but also from a financial perspective, that is producing profits, real profits, and also deliver well-being, economic development kinds of benefits. And so the work that I'm going to describe today comes directly out of working at this innovative intersection. I think a word about why we did the report is important, and I'm going to put it in terms that Chris Anderson framed for you just an hour ago. It's about going from a position of scarcity to abundance. And in this case, we start with data, or what was the lack of data about who are the customers, if you will, of development. For 50 years, development economists have largely worked in a vacuum of significant, broad-based data about who their clients are. And we shouldn't be particularly surprised, therefore, that there are enormous holes in the effectiveness of development policy. And it's largely been a top-down and rather than a bottom-up process of developing what knowledge development economists use to create policy. And so in some sense, we're really talking about looking at the long tail as well. And I would also propose that when I talk about, as I do fairly frequently, innovation at the edge, innovation happening in, as Chris also pointed out, in small companies, in individuals, in not necessarily always in large institutions. In fact, most often not in large institutions. We're actually looking at the long tail in a two-dimensional way, on edge. Right? Behind that innovation, in fact, is a long tail. And we're going to be talking substantially about finding innovation at what has been called the base of the pyramid. Now, I'll also suggest that the notion that CK and Al and Stu Hart introduced a few years ago, about half a dozen years ago, of the pyramid, the demographic pyramid, with rich people at the top, and Patrick just referred to the maybe 750 million people who are substantially well off in the world, and below them, increasingly poor populations with a very solid and stable base of the very poor, is actually a very unhelpful image. Because in reality, the world is precisely the opposite. We in the rich world live rather precariously with the weight of 4 billion poor people pressing down upon us. That the well-being, the aspirations of poor people impinge very substantially on our ability to live the lives that we do. And that we need really to completely change our perspective about how we look at the developing world, what it means to us, and how we should interact with it. So those are some of the sort of background ideas that I'd like to start off with. So the we began with the understanding that even though we had been doing an awful lot of work on business models, doing business case studies about how businesses were engaging with the base of the pyramid, and I'll use that term just because it is the term of art, the BOP. We had a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we had very little quantitative data on which truly to understand who the BOP are. How do they behave as economic actors in societies? And we set out to try and change that. And it's important both for the policymakers to understand who the objects of their policies are, but it's also important for business to understand how to relate from a commercial perspective to low-income populations. So, is the BOP relevant to strategy innovation? Yes, there's a two-word answer. It's mobile telephony. And we can see in the development of mobile telephones a very serious effort on the part of businesses, large and small, in fact, to figure out who are the customers and how one might be able to reach them. Oops, let me go back. In our data, we were able to show that mobile phone penetration increases steadily and begins really at very low levels of income. $1,000 PPP, purchasing power parity, terms per capita per annum. And it increases very rapidly. We drew a line for our purposes of our research around $3,000 per capita in PPP terms. Mobile phones are, why are mobile phones so rapidly accepted among even very poor people? And where, in fact, is the growth in the mobile phone market coming from? Well, it's coming from these areas in red that you see. It's coming from the developing world. What kinds of technologies are being used, in fact, to create this market? Well, they are technologies that are really at the edge. They are not landlines, and not even, in fact, cellular systems. The systems that are going to, in fact, be most critical in the growth of the mobile phone market over the next 10 years, 20 years, we believe, are going to be hybrid, very low-cost systems that combine Wi-Fi, cell, VSAT. They're going to be broadband systems. They're not just going to be voice systems. They're going to have very powerful capacities for broadband, which means that all that data, that all manner of material, knowledge, information can be transmitted very rapidly, entertainment as well. And it's also going to be internet. So that the tool that we believe is actually going to be most important to BOP customers is not necessarily a computer, but it's going to be a cell phone. Computers will have their place. Even the one laptop per child, the $100 computer, is going to have a very significant part in this, but the really transformative technology is the cell phone. And it's going to enable a whole range of activities. A very simple little, naive drawing here, but it's true. What's going to happen is that the cell phone is going to be a way in which to provide local telephony at virtually no cost, right? Chris talked about it, that the cost of providing this capacity is close to zero at this point. So that local phone service will be essentially free, but that can also do a whole range of things for low-income populations which are not now possible, but are becoming increasingly possible financial services, health services, agricultural services, educational purposes, and so on. So this capacity is going to become the very centerpiece of development. And if not the centerpiece, certainly critical to many populations. Let me just talk about a couple of examples of companies that have figured out how to do this both profitably and bringing development benefits. First is a company called Smart Communications in the Philippines. And what have they done? They have empowered literally hundreds of thousands. They, along with a competitor called Globe Telecom, now have millions of small entrepreneurs who are acting as the conduits, the salespeople, the distribution network for their services. They have created what is essentially a true bottom-up capacity. It's top-down and bottom-up, but they have empowered millions of entrepreneurs who have become the resellers of their product. All of this grew out of the propensity of Filipinos to use SMS texting. And when Smart and Globe introduced SMS texting, folks went mad for it. They started using it, and they, on their own, this wasn't really the company's idea, but it was the customer's idea, to actually start trading minutes. They would give away minutes, they would trade minutes, and very quickly, Globe figured out that they could leverage that. They created a system whereby people could very easily and effectively transfer minutes from one phone to another. Those phone minutes became a kind of proxy currency. People were not just trading the minutes, they were also trading, using it as a currency, and paying for things like taxis and for flowers and for vegetables and so on with phone minutes. Globe Cash came along and said, well, let's turn this action into an actual currency. Let's, in fact, enable a variety of financial transactions across the mobile network. And they started doing that very effectively. So let's go back right now to talk a little bit about the report itself. You have some sense of how businesses might, in fact, be able to use an understanding of BOP markets to better effect. Well, what did we do in the report that we think helps that? Well, first of all, it is the broadest and deepest look at BOP markets. It's based on household survey data done by national governments, and we have data on income from 110 countries around the world, and we have expenditure data from 36 countries. It is the first time that this data is publicly available. Until now, this data has been very closely held by the national governments and has been the domain of a few professional development economists, poverty economists, statisticians. So nobody has actually ever seen this data before, and particularly not in the format in which that we organized it. The report also tries to look comprehensively, rather shallowly, I must say, at the strategies, the business strategies that create value in dealing with, engaging with the base of the economic pyramid. It also looks at those strategies which are important to us in terms of seeing how development benefits are derived, well-being benefits, and that treat the BOP not just as a source of consumers, what it is that they can buy, but also what it is they produce, and their role as innovators in economies. There are enormous implications both for business and for the development community that are derived out of this work. So let's talk for a little bit about some of the specifics, and we'll talk about people first here. As we calculate it, there are 4 billion people in the world who can be properly called part of the base of the economic pyramid. And that means different things in different countries. It's less than $3.35 a day in Brazil, $1.56 in India. So we're expressing this in PPP terms, not in US dollars, so it varies. But what is the BOP as we see it? Well, the characteristics that run across the BOP are that they are poorly served, that first there are really significant unmet human needs. All lack access to various things that we take for granted. Second, all of the BOP is characterized by their economic lives being largely played out in the informal sector. And informality is a terrible trap. Informality means that people cannot get the benefit of the rule of law, regulation. They stand outside the capacity to capitalize whatever assets they have, to leverage whatever assets they have. Essentially, informality makes people vulnerable. Informality is also constrains growth. You cannot grow in the informal economy. You have to be within the formal structures of society in order to benefit from the capacity for growth. And they all suffer from what we call the BOP penalty. And that's comprised of three things. It's a price penalty. It's very expensive to be poor. There is a quality differential. People in the BOP usually get poor quality. And there is an access penalty. People either have no access or very limited access to goods and services that can increase their well-being. All of that is characteristic, in our view, of what we call uncompetitive markets. The BOP essentially is unserved by competitive markets. I was very interested to see that the Business Week that is in our packets looks at the poor in America and how poorly served they are by markets. The presence of markets is not a guarantee that either they will be competitive or equitable or really serve the fundamental needs of individuals. So markets need to be regulated, they need to be equitable, they need to be sustainable. They are not a panacea. Let me just go back just for a moment. This image that we have on the cover of the book is a pyramid of sorts, but it is not the demographic pyramid of C.K. and Stu and Al from years ago. It is, in fact, a picture of the BOP market. And what is that market? By our calculation, it's a $5 trillion market. That's nothing to sneeze at. But it is a market made up in the aggregate of lots of very small incomes and expenditures. It is, in fact, again, to use Chris's paradigm, it is the long tail, if you will, of markets. So, to be successful in accessing these markets and bringing benefits to these markets, one has to have business models, a way of developing goods and services, delivering them, that in fact can take advantage of the characteristic that this is an aggregation of very small expenditures. But you can see that, in fact, there are pretty substantial expenditures, and we use, by the way, it says income, but income and expenditures at the base of the pyramid are pretty much the same. There is some savings, but not a whole lot. But you can see that there are some very large markets in the aggregate, even at very low levels of income. What do? We look at this in real market research terms. We have the total size of markets. We have income and expenditures by region. Here's Africa. And it's a fairly bottom-heavy market. we have, here's Asia, here's Eastern Europe. There are different patterns. Eastern Europe is a more top-heavy market. Latin America and the Caribbean. These are all pretty substantial markets. We look at individual countries. Again, Nigeria, extremely bottom-heavy market. Ukraine, quite top-heavy market. We look we break down income and expenditures by sector. We studied 8 sectors in this particular study. Food, naturally, is the largest, but we also study housing, energy, water, you can see. An ICT, although it's a rather small market at this point, is actually quite a transformative market. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about transformative market strategies. We look at it by urban-rural. Asia tends to be quite rural. Anybody who's worked in the field in economic development in Asia knows that to be the case. Latin America, by contrast, is quite urban. But we have the numbers by country and by region. We look at household expenditures, and we can break those down by income segment. Here we have ICT, South Africa, and Russia. The average in Russia is only $53 and never gets to be too much. It's $82. South Africa, the average is 109, and in BOP, at BOP 3000, it's actually $244. It's pretty substantial for very low-income people. Well, what's going on here? Well, in South Africa, for example, in part it's a legacy of very centrally controlled, government-controlled ICT markets, relatively little competition, high prices. We look at business strategies, and we try to identify a number of business strategies that are particularly critical for businesses who wish to succeed in reaching BOP markets. What's the first one? Localizing value creation. This is consistent, for example, with Chris's notion about bottom-up instead of top-down. You have to, in fact, create value at each level of the economic chain so that, in fact, you link people into the process and of, in fact, creating an economic activity. Critical to this whole process is enabling access. The IT industry figured out quite rapidly how to create access. Bring the cost barrier down to virtually nothing. Why? Because they were able also to take advantage of the power, this decreasing cost of the technology, the decreasing cost of mass storage, the decreasing cost of broadband access. If you want to succeed at the BOP, you have to think about these customers as real customers, as customers that you want to serve. Most businesses have been incapable of doing that so far. There are enormous cultural barriers between businesses and the BOP, and those are, in fact, quite substantial inhibitors and need to be addressed. And companies have to actually work very hard at being able to do that, get beyond those barriers. To do that, to get beyond those barriers, often means unconventional partnering. It means that they are working with people that they are not familiar with, often local organizations, NGOs, community-based organizations, who in fact are quite close to the markets and who are able to create the trust relationships that enable business to do business. And we give examples throughout the book of the various ways in which companies do this. We found some pretty surprising results in the data. We tried to look at how patterns of expenditure change as people get richer. And we found that, in fact, in some sectors, food and housing, for example, expenditures go down as a percentage of income. And you can understand that with food. It's not necessarily quite as understandable for housing. But people make choices, and they choose, in fact, to spend their money in areas that actually are more productive and beneficial for them. Transportation and ICT are two that rise pretty steadily as income rises. This example from Mexico is as much an example, again, of the rapaciousness of business. Carlos Slim, who controls much of the mobile phone market in Mexico, keeps prices very high. But the same pattern, this increase, this preference for ICT spending as income rises, is quite consistent over every country. Transportation and ICT are very important in terms of productivity and well-being. They are substitutes for lots of things that are more expensive. A telephone call can replace a trip to the city. People are liberated by having personal transportation. So that first motorcycle or that first small car is actually enormously powerful in terms of creating well-being. The data show that, in fact, there is enormous buying power even at very low incomes. And we see that over and over again. Let me just do very quickly another sector that gives you some sense of how we went about our task. We do look at the market size and structure. We looked at what people buy, how much they spend. I've gone over that a little bit, and where the markets are, urban, rural, and so forth. In healthcare, we find that, in fact, it's a pretty substantial market. You wouldn't think that it's a $160 billion market for healthcare and BOP, but it is. And about half of it is, in fact, pharmaceuticals. People don't spend money so much on doctors and hospitalization as they do on medicines. And if you talk to people in the healthcare business who serve the low-income markets, you'll find that, in fact, it's largely an issue of distribution, that bringing healthcare to BOP populations is largely one of distribution. We can look at household spending. We can look at the share of spending. And we can see that given the choice, given a little bit more income, people spend 50% more on health care. And this is, again, a pretty consistent pattern, that they will spend more on health care as their income rises. We can look at, again, urban, rural. But we look a lot at what the transformative business strategies are. This is an example of a healthcare franchise in Mexico that is addressing the issue of distribution. The Farmacita is a locally owned company, and it is providing that which the BOP values. It's providing a range of over-the-counter medicines. A lot more is available over-the-counter in the developing world than here. And it is growing very rapidly. The same model is showing up in Kenya, in Uganda, CFW shops now called Health Store, and in India, Medicine Shop. The innovative business models of micro-franchising, for example, that is in evidence in these three cases, is also blowing back to the United States in the form of mini health stores, mini shops opening up. Minute Clinic, for example, is opening up in pharmacy chains in the United States and also in Target stores. Licensed doctor, licensed nurses on premise, walk-in, very low cost, access to the system. Distribution being the major problem for low-income populations in both the United States and in the developing world. So how do we approach the whole issue at WRI? What do we think are some of the solutions? Well, we think that there are absolutely critical sectors of the economy which need to be addressed, and you need to scale private sector enterprises to meet the needs. We start with understanding what some of the basic data around the markets, this was the next 4 billion process, finding what might be transformative sector strategies that can be replicated and scaled. And importantly, working from the bottom up on enterprise development. One of the big issues in the development business is that the large institutions, the large development institutions, World Bank, the multilateral development banks, Asian and Inter-American Development Bank, they don't know how to do small-scale enterprise development. All of their incentives are around pushing a lot of money out the door in big bundles. There are no incentives for doing lots of small deals. So we're going to have to, in fact, create the capacity to do that, hopefully working with the multilateral development institutions, but also working around them. Identify entrepreneurs, incubate the businesses, and provide the technical assistance, because human capital is really a serious issue. And then finally mobilize the investor networks and bring them together with the entrepreneurs. How are you going to achieve scale? Well, there are a variety of ways. You need to create networks. And this, again, is a sort of an open architecture. We've all been in the development business working independently, creating our own little silos, trying to differentiate our programs from the other guys' programs. That can't go on if we're really going to address this, make real progress on the issues. And so we're creating something that's called the Network for Inclusive Markets, and we're working with the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and private capital to make these a reality. You need also to be working on technical assistance, human capital development. In virtually every sector, as soon as somebody gets educated in the developing world, they flee to Chicago or New York or London or Johannesburg, someplace where they can actually make a lot more money. But you need to create robust local economies if we're going to make progress. So, just to sum up, there are a number of messages that we think are in this report. First is that there are very large, very significant, underserved markets. These markets can be served profitably. There are examples of the business models in play now. The BOP are showing a willingness to pay. They're showing, indeed, a capacity to pay. We may object on terms of equity about how much they're being asked to pay. And there are lots of fights over, for example, basic services, water, electricity, health care. Should they have to pay? Well, the point is that actually they do, and I'll get to that in a moment. They are paying today. Being successful requires appropriate strategies. These appropriate strategies may look an awful lot like what the development agencies do. But they are not CSR. I'm a terrible opponent of CSR. Why take 1% of your post-tax profits and put it into something that is actually in service of creating the markets of tomorrow? If businesses have anything more than a 2-year or a 3-year or a quarterly horizon, they have to look where their markets are going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. Are they going to be around to serve these markets? Don't you want to, in fact, make poor people richer? This is, again, a kind of another, Chris brought it up, saying, let's, instead of thinking about where the market is today, let's see where the market's going to be in 10 years and actually shoot toward that. And we're doing something quite similar. And you're going to need the right partners, as I've said. So the message for the development community is the poor are already consumers. They're already having to pay. In fact, the governments of many of the countries of the developing world, the governments are not supplying the services and may not even be particularly interested in supplying the services. So the private sector is being asked to do what governments should be doing in many cases, but are not. Private sector strategies have the capacity to provide solutions. They can arbitrage, if you will, this BOP penalty. And that's what businesses look to do every day of the year in whatever markets they serve. They arbitrage a price differential, a quality differential, or an access differential. Why not for low-income populations? It may demand different ways of organizing your company, different business strategies. But it can be done. It is being done. And there are profits to be made and development benefits to be derived by doing it. Only the private sector can tackle this task. There isn't sufficient money in the public system. There isn't sufficient political will. There's no way that governments are going to actually lead and complete the task of poverty alleviation. It has to be a private sector partnership. And finally, again, smart development and BOP market approaches look very similar, and they're complementary. That's it. The book is available online, every piece of it, including all of the country tables. And you can get it at that address. And I thank you for your attention.
So I have a question, Bill. Thank you. That was remarkable. Do you see, so this is an analysis of what the opportunity might be. Do you see the early adopters from the company's point of view to be small local companies in the emerging markets? Do you see them to be MNCs looking for this as a growth area? Who does it make most sense for to do something in this area?
A very good question. On the one hand, because of the size of the problem and because of the nature of the skills and the capital required, multinational corporations are a natural place to turn. They have the capacities, they have the systems, they have access to the capital. But they're not innovators. The thing that MNCs are great at is replication and scaling. And I talked a lot about replication and scaling as a critical component. So they have to be part of the picture. The companies that are close to the customers are often large national companies or small companies that are growing up. So they too have to be part of the picture. Where do we see the greatest innovation? Frankly, we see it in the medium to large national companies who are on a growth trajectory, who are close to their customers, and who are capable still of enormous innovation, who haven't grown so rigid and so large and so enamored of their cash cows, if you will, to prevent them from actually really stepping outside their standard procedures.
So if you pick a country that's moving out of being in the underdeveloped state to development stage, Korea, and go backward 20 years, would that be Samsung 20 years ago? It might be an example of that?
Yes. There's a great example of a business case study that is available to all of you called the Nike World Shoe. Nike tried to create a BOP product for China, and this was about 8-9 years ago, called the World Shoe. And they went from a standing start, no sales, to within 3 years being number 2 in China. And they were doing it profitably, and they canned the project. They killed it. Why? Because while they had understood the need to create a product for a BOP market that was special, they had created a tiger team, bringing people from across multiple parts of the company to talk to each other and innovate. What they hadn't done was to operationalize innovation. Once the product was in the pipeline, that division had to adhere to the same metrics, the same procedures that applied to their developed country markets, and they couldn't compete on that basis. So against what was the rate of the return on investment for product A in a developed market and the World Shoe in China, World Shoe couldn't compete. So they killed it. But had that product been developed when Nike was still a garage company, or even just $1 billion company and not a $10 billion or a $50 billion company, it would have been seen as an enormous success and would have survived.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. This was great.
Thank you.